You're listening to the Sass Says podcast. I'm your host, Christy Rocha, also known as Sass. I identify as a woman, a wife, and a mother. That should tell you a lot already. And over the last few years, I've learned the value of talk therapy. I have seen how my inner work not only enhances my own well-being, but also my marriage, my parenting, my relationships. And in fact, you wouldn't be hearing this right now if it weren't for the work I've done. My mission is to debunk the misconceptions and stigmas around what therapy is and who it's for. Let's normalize working on our mental health and seeking help when needed. We've all heard of self-care, self-help, and self-love, but do you often wonder how to actually make it all happen? I do. You'll hear strategy-based conversations with professionals, as well as inspiring and validating stories from women who are just like you and me. Think of this podcast as the weekly therapy sessions you didn't know you needed, with a dash of sass, a lot of vulnerability, and me, relentlessly asking, but how? Hello, and welcome to the first episode of this month's series focused on motherhood, pregnancy, and mental health. Today is the first expert interview, and I have Dr. Nicole Rankins. She is a board-certified practicing OB-GYN, wife, mom, and podcast host who is passionate about helping women get calm, confident, and empowered to have a beautiful birth. She's delivered more than 1,000 babies and has demystified childbirth for thousands more through her 5-star rated All About Pregnancy and Birth podcast, which also has over 1.5 million downloads, and her online birth plan and childbirth education classes. On today's episode, we discuss Dr. Nicole's experiences and advice on a range of topics related to pregnancy, childbirth, and healthcare. As examples, we talk about birth plans, how your partner can support you during pregnancy and delivery, and postpartum self-care and recovery. And of course, so much more. All right, here's Dr. Nicole. Hey, Dr. Nicole, so nice to meet you. Thanks for being here with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I like to get to know you a little bit before we dive into your expertise. Wondering why, if you could take us back, you decided to become an OB-GYN. Like, why do the work that you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I was in medical school, I knew that I wanted to do something that involved like procedures or being able to work with my hands, do surgery. And I initially went back and forth in my mind between general surgery and OB-GYN. And I liked women's health, so I ended up leaning towards the OB-GYN side.
And any regrets since then?
No, and I actually thought I was going to be, because I really, really like to operate. I thought I was going to be a GYN oncology, GYN oncologist, which is a GYN cancer doctor. They take care of women that have ovarian, uterine, cervical cancer, and they do a lot of surgery. They also do complex gynecology surgery. But I ended up like being on the other side of the spectrum, and like 99% of what I do now is birth, which I absolutely love, exactly where I'm supposed to be. But so no regrets at all.
Yeah. And I know this might seem like a like a silly, like, whatever question, but what did you always know you wanted to be a doctor? Like, how
No.
did that happen?
No, it's not. And it's not a silly question. I actually majored in college in mathematics and mechanical engineering. So I thought I was going to be, actually, I didn't know what I was going to do. I just decided I knew I liked math. I majored in math because I liked high school calculus. And then it was like, oh, you can go an extra year and also get a degree in engineering. And I was like, oh, that seems smart. So I'll do that.
Why not?
So I was majoring in math and mechanical engineering, not necessarily knowing what I was going to do. It's not like I said, I want to be an engineer. And then during the course of that, I was like, in the bathroom, and I was looking in the mirror. This was when I was in college in the dorm, and I saw myself wearing a white coat.
Wow.
And from there, the seed was kind of planted that maybe I should go to medical school. I think I might want to go to medical school. Now, my mother says since I was in 4th grade, she knew I was going to be a doctor, but I don't remember that. But that's my recollection, is that's how I remember. And it just kind of snowballed from there.
That's really a cool story, actually, to just
Mhm.
have that self-awareness moment.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Especially I
Yeah.
feel like in college, like that's pretty I find more and more that that's getting to be pretty young to know what you wanna do.
Oh, 100%. And college is so expensive these days. It's like, take your time and kind of figure things out. Don't feel like you have to rush through because otherwise you'll end up in like a ridiculous amount of debt and still not know what you want to do. So,
Yeah. Yeah, or you just do what people think y like,
right.
that you the people around you that you think they want you to do, right?
Exactly.
Then you
Yes.
end up unhappy, and then you have the whole crisis moment, and then you gotta
Exactly.
start over anyway.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Hmm.
So I heard your interview on Abby Williams's podcast, You the Mother, Mimosas with Moms,
Yes. Mhm.
formerly. And my show is all about mental health,
Mhm.
and obviously we can get into, and we will, all of the mental health implications that come along with pregnancy, delivery, motherhood. But what's really interesting about your interview on her show, which like she asked you about VBACs, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something you said in your response was something like, after you see a uterus rupture and you kind of trailed off, and later on you mentioned like being greeted by the baby with an arm instead of a
Mhm.
head. Like, what I think you were implying by that was, you don't forget seeing that, and you want to try to not see that again if you can
Mhm.
help it. And
Mhm.
it really made me think about mental health in that environment from the point of view of the doctor.
Mhm.
I feel like we almost never hear anything about that, and I just wonder what I know it's like again, a loaded question for you that you could probably take 1,000 different directions, but as the doctor in the room, what are some of the mental and emotional implications that you're kind of grappling with and dealing with, and how do you cope with all of that emotion? It feels like a lot.
Yeah. Also a great question. And you're right. This is not something that gets talked about a lot. And it's something that people don't realize that we go through. I can recall some distinct instances where we've had some traumatic things happen and you're kind of expected to just go and move on. I remember once we had a instance where a baby died unexpectedly, and but it was still like a busy labor and delivery floor, so we had literally like maybe even 10 minutes to just kind of process that what happened, and
Yeah,
yet still we have to go right back to taking care of other patients. There's not sort of a break or someone who's going to come necessarily and relieve you in those difficult circumstances. I just remember we were also like, we wish we could have had a moment to just kind of get ourselves together, but no, we have to get on to the next thing and show up with smiles on to greet people
right,
who are having a good experience. And that it's actually can be really hard, and it's stressful. Or even just in the course of, you may go from one room where, I mean, literally the other day I went from one room from a birth of a full term healthy no issues to another room where somebody was um not even halfway through, about halfway through their pregnancy, and was probably going to lose
mm,
twins. And we have to go back and forth between these things all the time. And then for some, I'm not in the office, but some people in the office, you have that similar sort of whiplash sometimes where you may be given bad news one time, and then go into a room where things are happy another time. And don't get me wrong, most of the time things are happy and we don't have those sad things, but it's actually something that it's not addressed or talked about at all in
yeah,
terms of the how we process that. Or another thing that isn't talked about or addressed is, obviously it's devastating to the family when there's a poor outcome, or when a baby dies unexpectedly, even if you know that it may be coming, or a stillbirth
mm,
that happens. Obviously those things are devastating to the family, but they also can very deeply impact the physician, and we don't or and nurses too, and we don't have any sort of systems or regular things in place to deal with that mental health aspect of our field at all,
mhm.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't imagine there's any time spent in medical school training over it,
No.
and it's probably like a blip on the radar screen, if
Yeah.
anything.
Mhm.
With your experience now,
is there any advice you would give to someone newer coming into the field of, you know what, we're not trained on this, but here are just a couple of things that I've learned to do over my years that have helped me get through those moments?
Yeah, so even if you can't take the time right then, sometimes you may need to take the time later to
Mm,
sort of decompress and process things. It can often be helpful to, if you can, to bring the people who were there together to talk about it.
mm,
Therapy, of course, is always a lovely thing
yeah,
to help. Journaling. I would also say, like, if it's someone who you feel like you were close with and you feel like you want to say, if there's a funeral, or if you want to reach out and write a note to that or something to along those lines, those human aspects can help you connect also.
yeah. Yeah, I think that it's so interesting because so many of the conversations that I have, whether it's with therapists or doctors, there always comes a point where we talk about, we're human too.
Mhm.
We, not meaning me, not
Right.
meaning me, we, but you, we.
Sure.
And and on one hand, that's so important to remember and to acknowledge. And I don't even want to say on one hand because I don't want to take away from it at all. It's like the two things can be true, right? You are a human being with feelings and emotions that you need to process. On the other hand, like you said, I just said the thing I said I wasn't going to do. Um, you know, you want, as just from my own experience as a mom who gave birth twice, yeah, you want the doctor to come in like I am all that matters.
Right.
And
Mhm.
my health and my
Mhm.
baby's health, and
Mhm.
you want that person to be able to compartmentalize, and
Mhm.
I'm hearing you now that it's just so much more complicated than that, and I can
It
think of even some of the nurses that I remember, one specifically that just rubbed me the wrong way, and maybe we just didn't jive, but now I'm going, "Huh, what was going on in some of the other rooms that maybe she just couldn't shake it as quickly as I
Mhm.
would have wanted her to. Not that she
Yeah.
should have been able to, but that I would have wanted her to, and that's
Right.
just it's very complex. It's very
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
nuanced as
Yeah,
well.
that's something people definitely don't realize. And yeah, and everyone expects to have, the best version of the doctor and nurse there for their experience. But again, we are humans, and
Yeah,
sometimes it can be hard.
yeah. And ultimately, just speaking from, the person on this side of it, it's like, ultimately, I have had, thankfully, enough experience with this of my own to say that even the nurses, doctors that maybe, for lack of a better way to say, like, rub me the wrong way,
Mhm.
at the end of the day, the professionalism as far as actually just taking care of me and my baby was there.
Right.
It might not have been warm and fuzzy all the time,
Right.
it might not but, like, and that I think is, and I'm processing now all of this in real time, you can hear it's just, okay, at the end of the day, that person actually did come in and did their job, like,
Right.
we all
Right.
got out of it, we all
Right.
survived, we all were
Right.
healthy and happy,
Right.
so,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah, it's hard. Um, okay, so, kind of switching gears for a moment just because I'm curious, you've now also added kind of an entire business to your plate, a podcaster, you're a speaker, you're on social
Mhm.
media, you've got courses. Why Why all of that? Why do all that?
Yeah. So, the podcast was really just a way to provide information about pregnancy and birth that was evidence based, holistic, and from a physician's perspective. I know a lot of people go to social media to look for things or outside of, nobody reads the pamphlets and whatnot that you get in the doctor's office. And so I wanted to go to where people are in order to provide information. And I noticed that there was certainly a lack of, at the time when I started things, and still to some degree, a lack of physicians in this space, and especially physicians, particularly physicians with the amount of experience that I have.
Mm,
So there are certainly, OB-GYNs, and I think I I'll say younger folks because I'm older, but there's not very many people. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years,
mm,
so who have the depth and breadth of experience that I have, and that counts for a lot in our field. So being able to show up and just help people and provide information. I didn't have any goals for in terms of how um like how many people to reach, or I was trying to get a certain number of downloads or anything like that. It was just like, I'm just going to show up and we'll see what happens. And then as far as the course, it was kind of a natural extension of seeing people and like, maybe I should do this from the perspective of an OB-GYN and specifically around hospital birth
Mhm.
and the things that I can add to help people be prepared for the experience. I started to see when I became a hospitalist, where I only work in the hospital. Before that, I was in the office, but when I became a hospitalist, I started to see how different doctors practice differently in some ways
Mm.
that were not appropriate. And so I just kind of got an appreciation that, wow, people can have really different experiences based on who's there. It just felt like it was, things that people should know. And then just sort of like realizing that we need to do better with the way that we take care of folks. So all of those things kind of came together, and the idea for doing a course also came about.
Yeah, very cool. I feel like what I was hearing was that you wanted to it seemed like you wanted to create something that I know I just keep seeing like a through line, right? Like you can come from all these different experiences outside, but once you get to the hospital and it's time, there are just very in I guess your view standard things that birthing women and birthing partners like they should know. Like you want to know.
Yeah, and not it's honestly a lot of it is just understanding like what happens in labor and birth period, because
Mm,
most people don't really know, because TV depictions and movie depictions are you know frighteningly inaccurate.
yeah.
So it was really just the basics of, okay, this is what's happening in labor and birth, and then adding the things like, okay, here's what it looks like when you come to the hospital, here's what to expect in terms of if you want an epidural, if here's what to
Mhm.
expect about, you should be able to move around if you want to, like all of those things,
Yeah.
and adding those particular details and layers to it. And with my additional perspective of, again, being in practice for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Were these the types of things in the course, were they things that when you were pregnant and giving birth that you knew?
I guess to some degree, yes. Because as an OB-GYN, I mean, yes. I knew, but for both of mine, I ended up having C-sections for different
Mm,
reasons. So yes, things that I knew, but then there were also some things that I had to learn, because physicians aren't necessarily or mostly in the room during the course of labor.
mm,
And we tend to show up like right when during the delivery. So there were some things definitely I had to learn in order to make sure I was presenting a comprehensive view of things. But yeah, it's hard to mesh or like separate, I guess, what I knew just beforehand versus what I learned as an OB-GYN. It kind of all runs together at this
mhm,
point. So
mhm.
yeah.
Okay. Talk to me a little bit about the birth plan. Like, I feel like more often than not, I hear that anytime you make one, it goes out the window. So, what are some of the benefits? What are some of the possible risks of making a birth plan? And what do you really
Hmm.
want women to know about doing it, not doing it,
Yeah.
etc.?
So it's called a birth plan, but more accurately should be called birth wishes, because
Huh, yeah.
birth cannot be planned. It's a completely unpredictable process. None of us can plan birth. People, doctors may say, oh, we can just induce you on this day. The specific outcomes that happen as a result that happen during birth are not because anyone could control them or plan them that way. It cannot be controlled. So
Mhm.
you can have wishes about how you think your birth or how you want things to go, but remember that None of it can be planned. Even if it goes exactly how you wanted, it is not because you decided that you were going to plan it that way. The
Mhm.
baby has the most control over what happens during birth, and they just refuse to tell us what they're what they're going to do while they're in there, and when labor's going to start, and how fast they're going to come. They don't tell us any of that. So, but it's important. Of course, it's normal, natural to have wishes about how this incredibly special event in your life should go, or how you want it to go. That's perfectly normal. Just know that you can't do any attachment to it, because it's the only predictable thing about birth is that it's unpredictable. So the other thing about birth plans is that it's pretty useless to fill out one of those forms and bring it to the hospital, or one of those templates, and just show up with it at the hospital, because you fill it out, you bring it to the hospital. So what happens if you hand it to the people and they're like, yeah, we don't do any of those things? Then you're stuck in this situation where you have no support for the things that you want for your birth. And that sets up a horribly antagonistic, uncomfortable situation. So
Mhm.
really, the piece of paper is the least important part of a birth plan, and just filling out a template or form isn't going to do anything without actually knowing whether or not you have the support for what's on the piece of paper. And that's a
Mhm.
conversation that needs to happen during the prenatal period. And it's more than just, here's my birth plan and handing it to someone. You actually have to have questions and go through it and talk about it, so you know that you have the support that you need. So those are the things I would want people to know. Like, you can't plan it. It's preferences or wishes. And then also, like, just filling out that piece of paper is not really going to help you.
Yeah. Okay, so talk to the potentially pregnant woman listening who hears that the plan is more of a wish.
Mm-hmm.
Everything you just said, like, and is feeling a lot of anxiety around that.
Yeah. So the best way to prepare for anxiety is to prepare yourself and understand what the possible things are that could happen during the birth process. So whenever I see that people aren't satisfied with their birth experience, the vast majority of time, it's not because it ended a certain way. It's not because I had a C-section or I got an epidural. It's because people felt like they didn't have any control or
Mm.
choices over what happened in their own body, and they weren't expecting that things could go away that was different than what they were anticipating.
Mhm.
So when you're prepared and you know ahead of time that, you know what, sometimes labor can be slow. Sometimes babies are breech, and that's just the way that they decide that they want to come into the
Mhm.
world. Sometimes cesarean birth may be the right option because labor, we've tried all of the things, and for whatever reason, the baby is not coming vaginally. So it's not because the people have a certain outcome for their birth, is that they weren't even aware or open to the possibility that things could be different than what they thought. I think some of the language around birth, not I think I know some of the language around birth that's used, like, your body was made to do this.
Mm.
You can do this kind of things. To some degree, it sets people up for some disappointment if they're not aware that, again, things can potentially go different. Now, most of the time, they can go fine, they go well, but again, it's hard to predict how things. You can't predict how things
Yeah.
will go, so you just have to be open to the process. So educate yourself about what happens in your body, what happens during birth. Educate yourself so you know that, hey, these are the questions I can ask to know that I feel comfortable with the decisions that are being that I'm making, and I'm involved in the decision making process. That's often something that I get a lot of feedback from either my people who listen to my podcast and have taken my uh, course, is that when the doctors and nurses are talking to them, they understand all of the things, and it doesn't sound foreign to them.
Yeah.
They understand, they know what questions to ask, and that just makes a huge difference.
Yeah, totally. I can understand how that would. I
Mhm.
remember, I think particularly with my second pregnancy, there was a lot of, "Oh, you've done this before, you know." And it
Right.
was like,
Yes.
I did
Right.
this, 2, 3 years ago, A,
Right.
and B, this is entirely different pregnancy." Like,
Right. Right.
and I have a toddler sitting in the doctor's office with me, so I'm
Right.
half distracted, half listening to you,
Hmm.
you know, um And and yeah, I think, this is where that comes in of, hey, we have to kind of remember that this is, even though the doctor does this all day long, like the woman
Right.
sitting there, doesn't. And, maybe isn't a
Yeah.
reader, maybe didn't read all the books. And
Right.
I certainly did not.
And well, and along that point, education doesn't have to be overwhelming. It can actually be pretty underwhelming in the sense of the time commitment that it takes.
Mm,
You can find like a good podcast. Obviously, I love my own podcast, but you can find a couple of podcasts that you want to listen to. You can take a childbirth education class, which may be, depending on the type of class, it's going to be mine altogether is about 10 hours of content, but it includes a lot of extra stuff. But you can take a good childbirth education class, and in the grand scheme of things, it's actually not a huge investment
yeah.
of your time. You can listen to things while you're doing the dishes or
Hmm.
going for a walk or in the car on your commute to work. So don't think that it has to be overwhelming
Yeah.
or you have to read every single thing. So a lot of us are saying very similar things in different ways,
Hmm.
and you're going to resonate or connect with different people. That's just the nature of human connection. Some people you connect with better than others, so find the people you like, listen to them, and stick with that.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a college course with
Yeah,
with a
exactly.
thesis
Yeah.
at the end, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that is, of course, the greatest benefit of having a doctor is that you're gonna get supplemental information regardless of how much you've read or not. Like, you can always that is your resource. The ultimate resource is, "Hello, you're my doctor. I have these questions," or "I don't know," and,
But yes, theoretically, yes. But I will say that in all honesty, like doctor's appointments are short. There's not
yeah.
education happening in
Yeah.
the doctor's appointments. You
Yeah.
will have to take it upon yourself to educate yourself. They just don't. There isn't time.
Yeah.
So don't expect that your doctor is going to educate you, because the reality is that more than likely they will not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's something that I think most women who get pregnant don't understand
Mhm.
either, though. So I'm glad you said that because that can also feel anxious too, coming in expecting a lot of information and hand
100%.
holding, and then you're not
Yes.
getting it and
Yes.
thinking, oh my gosh, what's
Mhm.
going on here?
Mhm.
Um, all right. So I'm sure that some of what I'm about to ask you is covered in your courses and certainly on your podcast. But for my audience here, if you had the opportunity to sit one on one with every pregnant woman in the world, what are some of the main things that you would make sure to tell them?
That's a good question. That's hard. Let me see if I can get it down to
I
like
know.
a few
Try
things. Um,
the key points, the key takeaways.
definitely this is something you should be an involved and active participant in this experience.
Mm,
Like sometimes people are like, well, I'm just going to go along and do what the doctor says.
mhm,
And if that's an approach that you want to take, that's fine, because everybody has the ability to make their own choices for themselves. But I think it's much more rewarding when you're an involved and active participant. You'll feel better about things
mhm,
if you educate yourself and take some time to get involved in your birth. I would definitely say that you have to be ready to advocate for yourself. Maybe have someone, not maybe, have someone with you who can advocate for you on your behalf. The reality is that maternal mortality and morbidity are both problems in our US system, where people have problems or death during pregnancy. Fortunately, it's not common, but it happens way more than it should. And
mm.
actually, at least 60% of these deaths are preventable. So
Wow.
you have to keep asking questions until you feel like you're satisfied. Don't ever feel like you're hurting someone's feelings or you're being difficult. If you are pressing on until you feel satisfied, I would say that, at the end of the day, it's you and your health and your body and your pregnancy. The doctor, the midwife, whoever, they're going to go home. They're going to keep
Right.
living their life. So definitely don't be afraid to advocate for things and start from a place of kindness and connecting with people, because human
Mhm,
connection always typically goes a long way. And that goes back to the beginning of how we were saying, like, we're humans also. So if you can say things like, well, I'm worried
Mm,
because I'm a Black woman and I see all of these statistics and it scares me and I don't want this to happen to me during my birth. Anyone
mhm.
who hears that and doesn't have a human reaction to that is that, like, then you need to run
Yeah.
because they're not.
Red flag.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a red flag. So, or say, I'm scared because my friend had this thing happen. So try to make a human connection. And if you don't feel that human connection, then find someone else. That's another thing that people, I think, don't do enough is change to another doctor if the one that they have isn't working for them, especially if they've been with that person for a while and
Mhm.
they were with them before pregnancy. So don't be afraid to change to find someone who is more supportive, because you deserve to have a great birth experience where you're respected, you're listened to, you're treated with respect and compassion, with dignity, all of those things. So don't be afraid to change if need be. And then I guess the final thing I would say is childbirth education. Please take some sort of childbirth education so you know what is happening in your body, you know the things to expect, you know the possible things that can happen. And it does not have to be overwhelming. There are so many options, whether in person or virtual, for childbirth education. Please just take some childbirth education so you are educated about what is happening during the birth process.
Mhm. Mhm. And I feel like we've talked, now a good amount about actually giving birth and delivery as far as some of the things that you would want women to know. I think the biggest one I heard was just almost like expect the unexpected and just have an
Hmm.
open mind. Is there anything else you
Absolutely.
would add to that?
Yeah, I think that is the biggest thing. And the
Mm,
other thing I would also say is, no matter how your birth experience unfolds, just know that there is nothing about what you do that is failing.
mm,
So if it's not exactly how you anticipated, it's not because you failed in any way, it's not because you did anything wrong.
yeah.
If you went to the hospital sooner than you thought and you wanted to stay home as long as possible, there's nothing wrong with that. If you decided that you wanted to try some medication when you wanted to do an unmedicated birth, nothing wrong with that. On the flip side, if you get to the hospital and there was no time to get an epidural because things were going so fast, that happens sometimes too. It wasn't your fault. Like sometimes labor happens. Okay, see, sometimes
Me.
labor just happens quickly. Like you've grown in a whole human being inside of your body, and there is nothing that can, you know, be close to failure about that. So don't think that there's anything that you did wrong or failed, regardless of how your birth experience turns out.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I think it speaks to, the ultimate mom guilt and things that
Mm-hmm.
we talk about a lot as moms, and it starts in pregnancy, right? Like
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
you're a mom. You're a mom. You're taking care of a growing baby, and
Yep.
I know even my experience with my first, just worried about even every little bite of food that went
Sure.
into my mouth, like,
Right.
"Is this okay? Is this not okay?" And I think it was fine to do that, right? But, um, not necessarily going to have any impact on actually the outcome, right?
Yeah.
How about recovery? Any advice or ultimate, like, words of wisdom for
Hmm.
recovery?
Yeah. Start thinking about what you're going to do postpartum around 28 weeks. So, in the late third trimester, start thinking about things like, obviously, there are things like childcare and your work plan and those things like that. But in
Mhm.
terms of your physical recovery, have a lactation consultant
Mm,
information handy if that's something that if you plan to breastfeed, because you don't want to figure out in the middle of the night that
yeah.
I really wish I could reach out to somebody about breastfeeding. You're not going to get much help from your OB-GYN. They're probably not going to see you until 6 weeks, although we're trying to change that, but they're
Mhm.
probably not going to see you until 6 weeks. So don't expect that you're going to get a ton of help.
Yeah.
from your OB-GYN. Definitely maybe consider a pelvic physical therapist at some point. They're highly underutilized in terms of helping people recover from postpartum. And then definitely give yourself some grace. You're a whole new person after you have a baby. So give yourself some space and some time to adjust to your new normal. It's probably going to be a year before you kind of settle into however it is you're going to be. So don't feel pressured that you have to snap back and, all of that social media nonsense that people put up after you have a baby. Just give yourself some grace, take your time, go at your own pace, and listen to your body. Just don't press things. You're a whole new person and you have to adjust to that accordingly.
Yeah. I'm
Also
hearing.
take time, sorry, to
No, no,
process.
good.
Also take time to process your birth experience if it didn't go exactly as you anticipated, or even if it was great. Like write it down, just talk yourself through it, just record it, process it if you need to. We also don't always give people space and time to process how things went for their birth, and that can kind of linger, and I think that's important too.
Yeah, because you leave that experience with a human.
Yes.
And you have to all of a sudden you're responsible for
Yes.
this little person.
Yes.
Or unfortunately on the flip side, you're not, and you need, grief, I think is what we're kind of getting at here, whether it went poorly or went differently than you expected and still had the outcome of bringing a baby home, or
Mhm.
unfortunately in the cases where it doesn't, there's so much grief in either case potentially that needs to be worked through. And of all of the professionals that you mentioned, I would just only add a therapist
Yeah, for
to
sure.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And there
Um,
are some therapists who specialize particularly in pregnancy related issues. If you can find one, then that's
mhm,
helpful.
mhm. And I think too, just to say from my own experience of, mentioning a lactation consultant and the pelvic physical therapist, these are the types of things that go back to, like you were saying, of this rhetoric that we have of, oh, your body's made for this. Oh, you'll figure it out. Like,
Mhm.
we need help, right?
Yes.
Like, we don't just pop a baby out and go, I'm a breastfeeding machine. Like, I
Right.
know what I'm doing. And
Right.
even every book that you read or podcast that you listen to, whatever, it's like, it's still your body, and that is
Mhm.
a unique experience. It's your body, it's your baby. You can't anticipate whether your baby's going to latch or not latch. It's like it's a lot of there's a lot of unique elements that in the moment, sleep deprived, all the things that you're going to have that to try to piece together on your own is really challenging.
Yes, yeah, and we also, even 150 years ago, birth used to be way more communal. So
Mm,
you'd have your mother, your grandmother, or your sister, other people around you who were able to support you after you had a baby, and we just don't have that as much these days. People who have gone through it, been through it, know how to help you recover from it.
right.
So another person to consider is a postpartum doula.
Hmm.
You don't necessarily, people think postpartum doulas can be, it's expensive and how can I pay for it? But you don't have to have somebody there every night. Even having somebody there like once a week to
Right.
help give you a break or talk you through things can be really, really helpful.
Hmm.
And I tell people, instead of asking for like 500 onesies on your on your birth registry, ask for some
Yeah.
contribution towards a doula. Ask for
Yep.
somebody to get you a postpartum doula or a birth doula if you want a birth doula. But I think a postpartum doula can be really helpful in that period to help you adjust and figure out all the things, even if it's just for a few hours a week.
Yeah. Yeah, the birth registry thing is like a whole issue for me. Like, we don't need wipe warmers. We need like meal delivery
Right.
services.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
it's
Yes.
just it's
Yes.
so
Yes.
like capitalism has like totally taken over
Yes.
this experience, and it's such a
Yes.
shame because
Yeah.
you don't know what you don't know until you're in the situation.
Right. Right.
until you've
Right.
had the baby and you're going, gosh, I
Mhm.
wish I just had healthy meals ready to go.
Yes.
Or I had more maternity clothes or bras or comfortable clothing that I have to spend money on and I could have asked for instead of a wipe warmer.
Right.
Like,
Right.
we don't,
Right.
babies don't need a wipe warmer,
Right.
you know,
Exactly.
they just
Exactly.
don't.
Yeah.
Um, and the other point that I want to make sure to highlight that you said is, it might take a year, it might take more to sort of start to feel like you even recognize yourself, your
Mhm.
body. Um, and I think particularly now, right? Like I immediately thought of those moms, I guess a little including myself, that had a baby in a pandemic, and a
You
year
know,
turns into 5 at that point, honestly.
yeah, I have really underestimated how challenging it is for folks who gave birth during the pandemic.
Mm,
Um, Between prenatal care being everything was just more isolating. Like
yeah.
we're not necessarily super connected anyway, but it was incredibly isolating. And
Mhm.
then you had this background fear of bringing this human being into the world with this virus. So I we will see, I believe, for some time to come, some of the effects and trying to work through some of the issues and things that people faced while having a baby during the pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the immediate was that my 6-week postpartum checkup was over FaceTime.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
"What?"
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
And I remember feeling really anxious about it, like,
Hmm.
"Am I gonna have to, show my
Yeah. Like,
doctor
what's
my
going to happen?
body over
Right. Right.
FaceTime?" And,
Right.
when we got on and he's like, "No, I'm just absolutely not, just gonna, ask you how you're doing," basically.
Right.
It was like,
Right.
"What?"
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I think, yeah, totally the isolation. I remember we had to take my son, he got a fever and the doctor wanted us to take him to the emergency room, and we're like, "Isn't the
Hmm.
emergency room, the most,
Right.
dangerous place right now?" Because it was March. It was
Right.
March that we were
Right.
doing all this.
Right. Right.
And, yeah, it's just, and now I think even seeing the effects on him as a toddler, the whole first year of his life was just me, my husband, and my daughter,
Hmm.
and so the attachment is
Hmm.
so much more noticeable,
Right. Right.
and just certain aspects of sharing and different
Right.
things that he just wasn't exposed to for so
Right.
long.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
that's a whole other thing. But I you mentioned it earlier, and I wanna give you the space to share anything else that you might wanna say about it, or just kinda ask you if you had the ability right now to kinda wave a magic wand over the maternal mortality rates. I know you've
Hmm.
talked a lot about it. It's specifically Black maternal mortality rates. Like, what do we start to do about this? Like, how do we start to really make change in this area?
Honestly, a lot of it is systems issues.
Mhm,
So, as we as a healthcare system have to improve the way that we care for people having a baby. So much of it just boils down to listening to people and believing what they say.
mm,
So, those two things are just very critical in our own system. And it's something that actually all women are exposed to or are at risk for. And it's even worse for people who are from marginalized communities that they're not listened to and they aren't believed. So it's really a systems part. But as a patient, you just I can't overstate how important education is and advocating for yourself and keep pushing until you get an answer when you know something isn't right.
mhm.
I had a story recently. This was a woman who was a physician and she was having some elevated blood pressures after her baby was born. And, essentially they just were a little bit entirely too dismissive of her having these elevated blood pressures, and she ended up taking herself to the emergency room and then
Oh,
got admitted to the hospital and
mm,
was in there for a couple days to get her blood pressures under control. So
yeah.
the sad reality is that you just have to be ready to keep pushing. And if when you're educated and you know the possible things, then you can do that. And I will say, start again from that human connection if you can.
Mhm.
And then if that doesn't work, then you do have to take it to the like, no, I need you to listen to me. You're not listening to me. These are my concerns. These are, you have to push it and take it to that level if need be, because it's your life, it's your well-being.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, my this is like, I don't know, I just always hear this in my head. My husband is that guy in our house that just, like, he won't take no for an answer with
Right.
almost anything.
Right.
And he always says, anytime I get uncomfortable around it, or anytime my, like, people pleasing tendencies come out, he's
Mm-hmm.
like, you know what? The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Sometimes you have to just be in someone's face, and not an aggressive way, but just, I'm not going anywhere
Mm-hmm.
until this is addressed. And it's uncomfortable, I think, particularly for women. I think
1000%.
particularly for women of color.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I think you're right. I think the best way to arm yourself is to just have that education and know that it's your body, and you know best, and can feel it
Mm-hmm.
in your bones. Like, don't
Yes.
underestimate the intuition part of it and the gut feeling.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also demand it just repeatedly, we need to demand that we're treated a certain way. Like
Mhm,
expect that you should be treated a certain way and speak up about it when you're not treated a certain way, even if it's smaller things. I
mhm,
believe the change that will happen in our system will come from people demanding it, like women demanding, like, we deserve better,
mhm,
because medicine itself is really slow to change,
mhm.
really, really slow to change. So the more folks who come to the conversation armed with information and knowledge. And obviously, you can't learn what I know after 20 years of experience,
Right.
but you know your body best,
Mhm.
way better than anybody else. And you can have some information. Like, we all walk around with personal computers. So don't underestimate the fact that you can be an educated and an informed participant in your health.
Mhm, mhm. Okay. One thing I jotted down, I think it was a little more relevant earlier in the conversation, but I wanna make sure to ask you,
Hmm.
is there any advice that you would give to partners of, like, I'm thinking of, like, just absolute, like, horror stories, like, in a funny way a little bit, but not funny, of, like,
Right.
the partner, like, complaining about being tired or something, like, any, like, do's and don'ts for the partners
Right.
involved in this process?
The biggest one, and this may come as a surprise, partners should do childbirth education as well. And the biggest thing that I see partners have an issue with is actually seeing their loved one in pain. They're
Yeah.
not prepared for that. And it's hard to see someone that you really care about in pain. And
Mhm.
pain is a normal part of labor. It's different pain because it's pain for a good cause. It comes and goes at predictable intervals. We know it's going to end eventually. At the end of it is a beautiful baby, but
Mhm.
people have a hard time seeing their loved one in pain. So be prepared with some education that this you're going to see a different version
Yeah.
potentially of the person who you know and love, and that's normal. It's not anything wrong, it's not anything that has to be fixed. This is a normal part of the process.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's, yeah, I can. It's funny, my husband won't admit it because he tends to be like the rock, and he was like such a rock during both deliveries. But I know when he gets quiet that he's feeling something,
Right,
like, just
right,
like,
right.
okay.
Right,
Like,
right,
almost like telling himself that he has to be the rock so he gets
right,
quiet to, like, focus on it anyway. I
right.
don't know. Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you feel is important to let women know, mothers know, potential mothers know?
um I can't, other than just give yourself some grace would be the biggest
Yeah.
thing. Like, we're all works in progress, we're all doing our best. Don't fall victim to the traps of social media, that everything has to be picture perfect and your nursery has to be this or that. Really, babies just need love and a place to sleep and like a diaper. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be complicated, and find a rhythm that works best for you and your family and your unique
Mhm.
circumstances, and know that that is great. That's perfect. That's exactly how it should be. And it can look perfectly different and, completely different than what someone else does. And that is okay. There is no one right way that things have to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And I guess the last thing I want to ask you, Dr. Nicole, um is there anything that you personally, just as a person, wish that you could talk about more, or that you wish people ask you more? I just think of it as
Oh, that's a
like,
great question.
like you could probably do a ton of interviews where people want to know all about birth and delivery and babies in this,
Right.
but what is it that you really like to talk about, or that you wish more people would ask you about?
Huh. I never thought about that. I would say not necessarily talk about, but we would solve so many problems if we would just take a second and step back and put ourselves in the other person's shoes and try to understand their experience and perspective and divorce it from like a personal sort of thing.
Mm,
I say that in the context of like, oftentimes when you see someone who's angry or upset, like it's not you. When I
mhm,
have a patient who comes into, sometimes it's fear,
mm,
sometimes it's past experiences. So develop empathy
mm,
for trying to understand other people's experiences. I think we would all just get along a lot better in that regard. And then the other thing I would say is that it is often overwhelming to think about the number of problems, issues, things in this world that can be, whether it's gun violence, whether it's maternal mortality, whether it's stripping away our rights to make choices over what happens in our own bodies,
mhm,
whether it's housing, whether it's food. There are so many things and it can feel overwhelming. But find one thing, find your one thing and do whatever you can for that one thing. Just feel like you can help in one small area, and that's enough. That is enough. Whether it is you give of your time, whether you give your money, whether you have any particular service that you can provide, don't feel like you have to do all of the things, because you'll quickly overwhelm yourself with like trying to think you can address all of these problems. So find something that's passionate for you, that feels important for you, and do what you can to work on that. I think if we all picked our one little thing, we
mhm.
collectively make a lot of change.
Yeah. I could cry hearing that. Like, truly, I'm feeling emotional because I feel that not only, with what I do here, right? Like, I have interviews across the board on all different areas of interest, and all coming back to mental health, mostly women's mental health. But I swear I leave every interview ready to be the champion for that cause,
Hmm.
because I hear someone passionately talk about it and I go, oh, now I have to help them. I have to do it. And it's actually so emotionally overwhelming,
Hmm.
because I have to catch myself in not feeling pressure, not feeling failure for not,
Hmm. Hmm.
it still sticks with me. I did an interview like a year and a half ago with a therapist who specializes in adoption. And, I left it being like, I'm going to change adoption in this country. And like,
Right.
I've not done a thing about it since. And I still think about how I've not done a thing about it since,
Right.
and
Right.
yeah. And I think too, personally, on my listeners know, like, I've on this whole like self-development journey, and
Hmm.
it's like I can't work on everything all the
Hmm.
time.
Yep.
It's
Exactly.
infuriating, but
Hmm.
it's truth.
Yep. It is the absolute truth. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nicole. I want to say too that I just respect you so much, and I've followed your work for a long time, and one thing I really just love about you, and if the listeners haven't seen your website yet, I just love, in the about about you, you go down and it's like, I'm really smart.
I am.
I know. And I just saw that. I was like, yes, like this is, it's everything we've been saying, like advocate for yourself, speak up for yourself, like be proud and loud of who you are. And
Yes.
I love that about you. And I just appreciate you so much and appreciate your time. So
Oh,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, shining your own light does not dim other people's lights. You know, we
Yeah.
can all shine our individual lights very bright and shine our light on other people's lights, and we can all be bright and beautiful together. So.
I love it. Well, thank you so much.
All right.
All right. Loved it. So good. Okay. You know the drill. I'm sharing my detailed thoughts and experiences related to pregnancy, delivery, and mental health on this coming Friday's solo episode. In the meantime, have you signed up to join us for the live Zoom panel at the end of the month? This is your chance to ask your questions and interact with the experts on all things motherhood, pregnancy, and mental health. Go to www.sasssays.com/panel to sign up. You must sign up in order to get access to the Zoom or the recording. All right, I'll see you Friday. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Sass Says is a production of Luann Nigara, Inc. This podcast is meant to be educational and not meant to replace professional therapy or professional medical attention. To learn more about today's show and what's new in my world, head over to sasssays.com. Thanks so much. Talk later.